has two controls, you got a lot of gain in that preamp section. You want to look at them 12 AUs and some things along with it. Yes?
Yeah, so Adam and I were talking about the mouse amps. They changed speakers at one point, and the speakers, some of the earlier speakers have a little cone in the middle.
Okay.
Inside the main
right.
cone, and the later ones didn't.
These cone,
the dust cone?
No, an extra little cone that sticks out about 2 inches. What that does, kind of like a tweeter, and that's exactly what it does. It increases your high frequencies response of the speaker, just like a ribbed speaker. When you're choosing a speaker, it's a matter of tonal preference. That may be what you like, but I would suggest really looking hard at smooth cone speakers. You're gonna have a little bit less high-end response on a smooth cone speaker, and which is generally helps again a little bit with feedback. And we want to find all these little things that help as building blocks to help control the feedback. They all add up.
That's actually, it brings up another important thing you should know about speakers in general, is that speakers are kind of directional. And very often the sound that's heard 10, 20 feet in front of the amplifier is really different than I'm hearing from here. That's the tightest mic clip in the world. But you'll see a lot of guys stand here and set their amp up like this. They blow into the mic and they adjust knobs. You can't hear nothing here. Okay, don't adjust, you can, if you know what you're doing, set it where you had it last time. And then walk out as far in front of it as you can and hear what people are going to hear. Okay, you need to hear on stage, you don't have to hear the best tone. Just be aware, and also when you're standing at jams, if you're having trouble hearing yourself, get away from the amp. If you can get, especially for smaller amps, if you can get it up at ear level or closer to ear level, like up on a couple of milk crates or on top of somebody's amp case, these are good ways to help you hear on stage.
You had a question? Sound diffuser. I've heard them called diffusers. It prevents the beaming of the speaker, the concentration of high frequencies right here, and again kind of broadens the range or width of your sound. It looks like good technology from what I've seen. I don't have any practical experience with them, but I would think it would help. To what degree is probably subjective. Works great. Yeah. Yes?
When you slot the AU tubes in there for the AX7s, you didn't have to rebias.
Okay. Well,
good question.
It does. You don't have to rebias your amp. When people talk about biasing your amplifiers, they're talking about the bias of the power tubes. If you change power tubes, different, as long as you're keeping the same type, no problem. If you try to put something different in there, you may draw too much current, your plates run hot, and the bias should be set. But in the preamp section, changing tubes does change the bias voltage, but it's okay. Lower power tubes, like the 12 AUs, draw more current, and it'll actually raise the bias voltage, which lowers your preamp distortion, having a positive effect overall.
What do you mean by the same type? You say you swap them out for the same type?
I mean like 6V6 for 6V6, or 6L6 for 6L6.
Why would you swap one?
Okay, that's them.
What's your question?
You said you swap them out for the same type. Oh, you mean like
Randy's talking about in the preamp section when we're talking about a 12 AU versus an AY versus an AT versus an AX. They're in the same series.
The tubes I mentioned are power tubes. Everything in the preamp is 99% of the things can start with a 12. They're little triode tubes. They're smaller.
So I'm gonna interrupt the question so we can make sure that we get to mics and tone, and then we'll come back and catch the rest of the questions. Is that all right? And a good transition between amps and mics is about miking amps. So I've got this small amp, isn't it? Can I just mic it? Well, miking an amp is a really good way to get a small amp's tone out into a big audience. And you've heard Adam that's his rig, and it's fabulous. He gets great tone because little amps tend to have really great sound. They do. The limit is your ability to hear on stage. Okay? How many of you guys are in a band? Okay, and how many of you jam? Keep your hands up, band members. Okay, now of all of you, how many of you have a sound guy? Okay, one or two. This is the problem. If you don't have a sound guy, it's really tricky to manage miking an amp because you'd have no idea how loud it is out there. You could be blowing people's eardrums out, or you could be too quiet, and it's really hard to tell on stage. If you're practiced at it, you can certainly set a level for out there, and that solves the problem of helping people hear a small amplifier, helping you guys hear it in the audience. It doesn't solve the problem of me hearing it on stage. What's the solution to that from a sound guy? Well, put some sound in the monitors. And the problem with that is, once again, PAs are gainy too. And when you have very much of your sound coming back at you through the monitor right here, you're going to have feedback problems. And so the only way that's manageable is if there's a sound guy who's not only there, but paying a lot of attention and understands what's going to happen to you if he brings your monitor level up. I play saxophone too. Now for saxophone, I can get a lot of monitor so I can hear myself really well. If I played harp through that same mic with that monitor setting, it would be Feedback City. Right? So that's a short course on miking amps. There's lots of ways to mic amps and lots of opinions from different sound guys about whether you should point the mic at the middle of the speaker or at the edge, or put it at an angle, or put it straight, and experiment and do what sounds best. One of the cool things about mics is you can experiment like crazy. You can't really hurt these things. If you hook them up to the, a low impedance mic to a high impedance amp and a high blah, 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 you can't hurt it. It might not be right, but you won't hurt anything because there's almost no power generated from these things. Grab a sip of water.
An Audix Fireball?
Yeah, so I want to introduce microphones. There's a couple of classes of microphones. There are what I call stick mics. These were primarily designed for vocals. There's the venerable old Shure SM57. This happens to be an Ultimate 57, which is shorter and lighter, and that's cool for harp players, but we can talk about that separate. There's the SM58. You'll see these on almost every stage in the world. It is the single most popular microphone in the world. It's a great vocal mic. It's a great acoustic harp mic. Another acoustic harp mic that's in that same vein is the Audix Fireball. You hear a lot about those. So these mics are on the clean end of the spectrum. Really nice acoustic tone, okay? The Fireball is an engineering marvel, but it turns out that engineering marvels are bad for harmonica players in some ways. Engineering advances happen in two ways with microphones. One is more frequency response, and the other is more headroom. And headroom is the ability to tolerate higher and higher sound pressure levels without distorting. If the mic doesn't distort, you can't get the big fat sound out of the amplifier that you might want. If all you want is an acoustic sound, great mic. If you want to be able to control the range of sounds and go from clean to fat with your hands, Fireball's not so good. Even cupped, it's not very dirty. Well, but that's the 58 is also a really nice, clean acoustic mic. It's a little more responsive to hand effects. Okay? So you can actually have a little more range of tonality with a 58 than with a Fireball. And yes, I admit a slight selfish bias, but it's true. The most versatile microphone in the world is the SM57. You can use it for vocals. It's not as popular as the 58, largely because you have to be closer, you have to be right on axis with it. You can't go as far off. So maybe not as good for a chromatic either. But what the 57 does better than these other two, it also has, it still has a really nice warm acoustic tone. But when you cup it, okay, it dirties up really nice. Not quite as far as a bullet's gonna go. So now let's talk about bullets for a second.
That's your compression, and I'm going to talk about 3 different ways, 3 different types of distortion that are referred to as compression, and are actually 3 very different types. And I feel a lot of times it gets confused, and we're going to elaborate on that a little bit more in a little bit.
Does anybody know what the highest note on a harmonica is? What's that? The 10 below. On which harp? How about the F sharp? Okay. Anybody know what the frequency of that is? About 3,000 hertz. Okay. It sounds really high, but it's only about 3,000 hertz. Do you need a microphone that goes to 17 kilohertz? Probably not. Okay. That isn't to say that there aren't some higher frequency components in your sound. Anything that makes sound and acts with other sounds generates overtones at other frequencies, harmonics and overtones. And so more frequency response is an okay thing. But one of the reasons that people use bullets is that they were used way back when by the early guys, and some of us want to sound like that. And the reason that they sound like that is that those elements were low-tech compared to what comes out today. The frequency response of a typical vintage element it comes up to about 7,000 hertz. And that's generally plenty for any harmonica application. Whereas one of these SM57s or the Fireball probably goes to 17,000, 18,000. So frequency response is one of the things. And the other thing that the old elements didn't do as well is hold up to high sound pressure levels. Bad from an engineering perspective, good from a harmonica player perspective. That's why a lot of us crave vintage elements. If we're looking for that fat Chicago sound, I'm not talking about a clean country tone. So these elements, this is just a controlled magnetic element dating back to the 50s or so. Controlled magnetic and controlled reluctance are terms you're going to hear a lot. They were Shure marketing names for Shure's elements. They are dynamic elements as opposed to crystal, which I'll talk about in a second. But these, when you can really overdrive them, has a lot to do with cupping, and I'm going to talk about that when we get to tone a little bit. But just to compare it to those other two you just heard. Always remember after your break to take the amplifier out of standby. Okay, so your fattest sound is going to come from an old bullet. Briefly, there were 2 classes of elements. There were the dynamic elements and there were crystals. They have different electric principles about how they make sound and slightly different characteristics to the sound they make. But believe it or not, it's not that different. 99% of this comes from you and your technique, your amplifier. So let's see, are there questions about microphones specifically?
You know, when you mentioned the hertz, would that be stamped on my element?
No, you're not going to find the spec for the frequency response stamped on the element. You will find it in the literature that came with the element if that's still available. And to find the old Shure literature, you can go to their site.
How would I date the element?
Well, if you want to date the element, I think first you should buy it a drink. There are date codes on Shure elements, and if you go to Dave Cott's website, which is greenbulletmics.com, you will find the date coding. They've changed it a few times.
Right. I've got 2 different ones. I bought one last year. They're both Shure
Anything built come from the 65 or earlier is going to be comparable. The specific dates really aren't important.
Yeah. What's more important is the changes in generations. Let me just talk about that real briefly. When the elements, these elements first came out, they were called controlled reluctance elements. And I personally believe Shure changed the name to controlled magnetic purely for marketing purposes. It happened to correspond with a change in design. So there were a few changes in the earliest controlled reluctance elements. They started production in 1949. They went from a black label to a white label in about 1953. And at the same time, they changed the material that the coil was wound around, which probably has zero effect on tone. A little while later, I think they went to white labels, by the way, because they could print more clearly on the white labels and they printed more information. So instead of just a model number and a date code, they had Shure Corporation and they had a patent notice and this and that. I believe that's why they changed label colors. The original green bullet was a model 520 and it had the controlled magnetic element in it then in about 1958, something like that. Dave's site will give you the exact number. And that's what I call a single impedance controlled magnetic element. There were even two subtle distinctions among those. The earliest ones used a different glue to attach the little pin that moves up and down inside the magnet there to the diaphragm. And this is really trivia, but if it has opaque glue on it, it sounds better than the newer ones, which had a kind of a translucent brown glue. Then they came out with a 520D in the early 80s. And the D stands for dual impedance. And the reason was that Shure wanted to make fewer mics and serve more people, and more low impedance gear was beginning to show up. Remember, these mics were never made for harmonica players. They were made for utilitarian, heavy-duty, rugged applications like the teacher's microphone for announcing at school, or the taxi dispatch, or the factory floor PA system. We didn't have, pagers and stuff like that in that era. The 520D element is called a 99S556. They had hardly any different model designations. It's a little harsher, but it's still got pretty good tone. And then sometime in the early 90s, Shure changed over to the 520DX bullet. And that is what, when you start playing harp, somebody says, you gotta go out and get a green bullet. So you go buy one because you didn't know there were different kinds, and you get a 520DX. It's the biggest, heaviest weapon of a microphone. It has a modern dynamic element with a mylar diaphragm, which creates higher frequency response, but it doesn't sound very good. I bought one in a Fender Blues Junior as my first amp because I thought the name sounded cool. And looking back, that was wasted money. It was just wasted money. You could do a whole lot of work to a Blues Junior and turn it into a good harp amp. It's not a good harp amp off the floor. You now have the advantage of the internet and forums like Adam's to start asking questions. And so the only thing you have to learn now is to put on the filter of who do you trust? Who do you listen to that actually knows what they're talking about versus the guy who bought an amp and he wants to believe that it's cool, so he tells everybody else that it's cool. Okay, make sure that you check out your sources. So anyway, that was the evolution of green bullets. The 520DX, by the way, is the easily identifiable because it's the only one with a built-in volume control, and it's even bigger and even heavier than its precursors, which were still pretty heavy. Okay, I need more water. So we'll talk about tone.
Talk about tone. Well, compression, compression is a term that's used a lot by harp players, and it is usually a type of distortion that is desired. It sounds good. And there's three different types. The first type of compression is microphone compression. It comes from a good cup, and really in all three types of compression, it's all about pushing the element beyond its designed capabilities. We want to put a hotter signal than what that element in that microphone can carry. And once we do that, it stops forward, stops moving back forward, stops moving forward. And in that creates the compression. In a microphone, the compression is a smooth compression. It's a desirable compression. It sounds good. The other type of compression that we like is power tube compression. And power tube compression is where that crunchiness comes from in our amp. And when you combine the microphone compression with the power tube compression, you get exactly what you hear from Greg. You get in that classic vintage tone that most of us desire. Another type of compression you hear, you'll see even compression pedals and stuff, it's a solid state compression. Solid state compression sounds totally different. It's harsher. It doesn't have the harmonics. It isn't pleasant sounding. It's fuzzy sounding. So when you see compression typically on like a pedal, that isn't a type, it isn't going to give you the tone that you're going to get from cupping the mic properly and from a properly set up amplifier.
There's one other thing about that. Randy said, you know, microphone compression is good. That's true for the mics that we tend to play. But you know the little itty bitty lapel mics you see people use? They're called condenser microphones, electret condenser. They very often can be identified by having a battery with them. Those things sound terrible when overdriven. So good for acoustic playing, really lousy if you want to be able to overdrive. So I want to talk about tone a little bit.